Thank you very much and good afternoon. It is a great privilege to be part of the launch of this work of the Foundation here today. I would like to congratulate the Foundation to have chosen education as its key subject. It's not just because there's more money going to education, but more importantly, it's an indicator that education is a social project. That education is really everybody's business. And that has never been as important as it is today. Since we are in a central bank, I'm saying very expressly that skills, not money, is the currency of the 21st century. But unfortunately, this currency has a high degree of inflation. The skills that we have today are not going to be enough for the skills that we will require in the future. Just to give you sort of a brief indication, we have just done, you may be familiar with PISA, we have just done a kind of PISA for adults. We actually tested the skills that people have, not the qualifications that they got, that's another question, but the skills they actually have. And we looked at what are the consequences of those skills. And you can see the first thing is, of course, you earn more money if you're better skilled. And actually the relationship between your earnings and your skills has become tighter and tighter and tighter in virtually every country of the OECD. The inequality of incomes is largely driven by the inequality of skills, but it doesn't stop there. You can see that skills are not just driving employment and earnings, but they are also driving things like trust in our societies. You can ask yourself, so why does the OECD measure something like trust? Well, we are an economic organization, but you know, trust is the glue of our societies. If you do not trust your neighbor, you know, if you do not trust the institutions, if you do not trust the police, if you do not trust your business partner, no democracy is functioning, no business relationship is functioning. You can actually see trust is not just something to do with how you were brought up, your parents, your environment, but actually we can squarely relate it to the skills that you have attained. Your willingness to give back to society, the propensity of people to actually volunteer, directly related to the skills they have. Sort of many dimensions of our economic and social spheres that actually have squarely to do with how well we are equipped for our societies. And again, this relationship becomes more prominent. Political efficacy. People at the high end of the skills distribution see themselves as actors. They believe, I can make a difference in this country, in this society. People at the low end of the skill spectrum say, well, you know, there's nothing I can do. I'm a victim of our societies. Politicians are going to do whatever they want to do. I have no influence on that. Skills, the essential driver of our societies. But at the very same time, you also see that education is not a guarantee. More education doesn't automatically translate into better jobs and better lives. That's the hard lesson many young people learn, particularly during the period of the financial crisis. You can see that in data where we actually surveyed employers, you know, in terms of do they find the people with the skills they need? And actually what you can see, the Czech Republic is actually in a quite favorable position on this, but you can see in many countries, there are on the one hand unemployed university graduates on the street struggling to find a job. And at the very same time, employers telling us we cannot find the people with the skills they need. If you turn your television on, you look at Egypt. Now you see all these unemployed youth graduates demonstrating on the streets. But last year, Egypt had 600,000 vacancies for highly skilled labor they couldn't fill. This is what's going on, and this is why we have to be much better at figuring out what are the kind of skills that drive economic and social outcomes. How do we develop those skills in efficient, equitable ways? This is about relevance, efficiency, equity. How do we actually make good use out of those skills? You know, productivity is always the result of two things. The skills that you develop, the skills that you have, and how well you actually deploy them. And then finally, of course, the big question always, you know, who should pay for what, when, and how? Some people believe it's all the business of government, but actually when you look at those countries, they are generally not the ones that do really well when it comes to equipping their citizens. Some people rely totally on markets, but you can also see there huge challenges in terms of equity and sometimes quality. It's a question of, you know, figuring out, you know, what are the benefits and costs to individuals, companies, and enterprises, and society that should help us answer those questions. Lots of really, really difficult questions to address today in a very short period of time, of course. And I want to just highlight some of the things that we know about the future. Now, this is about the 21st century. It's just starting. It's going to go on for a long time. But we know a certain amount of things. Globalization. No? China and India getting a bigger and bigger share of our world economy. In the past, globalization was easy for the Czech Republic, a highly advanced industrial economy, highly educated labor force, competes with a China that provides low skills at low cost. No? Anybody can do that. Today, China providing better and better skills at moderate costs. Very, very different story that we're going to see in the years to come. Social and economic inequalities you can actually see in every country. Income inequality is rising. It's not very strong in the Czech Republic. It's still doing quite well in relative terms, but on the rise as well. And this translates directly into 21st century classrooms. It means more diverse student population, students with greater diversity in needs, interests, capacities, social context. Big challenge for 21st century schools. Migration. Everybody wants to live in the industrialized world. And we always think sort of we have reached the tip of the iceberg here, but actually this is a trend that is intensifying in most of our countries. Education systems that struggle today with educating for diversity, with personalizing learning, should really think hard what the future is going to look like. Knowledge intensity. Think about productive research and development measured in the number of patents. You can see really how dramatically that part in our economies is rising. And that translates directly in the people who are working in the Czech labor market. Look at this here. Basically, this is the share of people working in research and development in 1996 and 2009. And you can see the Czech Republic is not yet at the frontier, but the share is more than doubled in a very short period of time and history. No? Research intensity, knowledge intensity of our economies, our societies on the rise. Again, big implications for the way in which our education systems work. But the most challenging aspect is the kind of skills that made us successful are not going to be the ones that make our children successful. I don't have data for the Czech Republic. In fact, to my knowledge, there is actually no data on the demand for skills for your country. But I'm showing you some data for the United States, which has a very nice time series on this. And this shows you about changes in the demand for skills. The first thing you see when you look at this chart is that the demand for manual skills has declined. No? Those jobs got automated, machines can do these things better than humans, so very, very natural trends, the gray and the black line. But the steepest decline in the demand for skills is no longer in the area of manual skills. It's in what we call routine cognitive skills. Your capacity to learn and then reproduce knowledge. And the kind of things that are easiest to teach, the kind of things that are easiest to test, are the kind of skills that are losing most rapidly in labor market relevance. Because those are the kind of things that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. If you have a job, you can explain to someone else, and well, anybody else in the world can actually do that today. Success today is about your capacity not to reproduce what you learned, but to extrapolate from what you learn and to apply your knowledge in a novel situation. You can see that very nicely in what we call the demand for non-routine analytic skills. And that's precisely what we're looking at when we, for example, test students with PISA or PIAC, our adult skills. This is not about, did you remember what you learned in school, but can you actually extrapolate? Can you transfer what you have learned? We often get criticized for this. People say, well, this is a terribly unfair assessment because it tests young people with things that we haven't taught them in school. No. Well, but then you also have to call life unfair, because the test of truth today is not, can I remember what I learned in school, but actually, can I extrapolate, can I apply? And these changes are really real, big changes in the demand for skills. When you think about it, what matters today is your capacity to be creative, critical thinking, judgment, problem solving, ways of thinking. It has to do with ways of working, communication, collaboration, growing in relevance. It has to do with the kind of tools that we need to work, information literacy. No? Literacy today is about something very different than it was in the past. When we started measuring literacy in the year 2000, literacy was about reading text, reading a book. No? Today, how many books do we read? No? Literacy is about navigating complex hypertext on the internet, building a mental representation of text that we don't see in front of us, managing conflicting pieces of information, no? Building your own truths as you navigate through information. Very, very different kind of tools. And of course, all of this is about enabling young people to live successfully in an increasingly complex and ambiguous world. Very, very different skills challenging the 21st century. When you think about it, the 20th century versus the 21st century, in the past we thought about learning as a place, you know, we brought children into schools, we taught them something, and that was it, really. And that was justified. In the past, in the 20th century, school had the monopoly on learning. It was the only place where you would get materials, knowledge in a book, and all these kind of things. Today, school is one of the contributors. Learning occurs in many settings, and learning needs to occur in the life throughout our lives. In the past, we thought about the provision of education. You know, we defined education to class sizes, teacher salaries, working hours, and these kind of factors. Today, we got to think much harder about the results that we want to achieve and that we do achieve. In the past, learning was highly prescriptive. No? We had a very industrial work organization of education where, you know, governments figured out what students should learn, handed out textbook, and then teachers were meant to basically use those kind of textbooks. Today, that approach simply no longer works. No? The best performing education systems rely on a very, very advanced profession that actually creates the wisdom of its practice. The past was about looking upwards in the bureaucracy, to the school principal, to the government. Today, the test of truth is, can I look outwards? Do I know what the next teacher is doing in my school? Do I know what the neighboring school is doing? Do I know about the professional practices throughout the system? The past was about administration management. Today, it's about leadership, building human talent in my school. In the past, we thought about public versus private schooling. Today it's about, you know, how do I integrate the strengths of public and private initiative? The past was about uniformity, teaching all students in a similar way in highly stratified education systems, grouping, sorting students, then educating them. Today the key is personalization. The best performing education systems are very, very good at individualizing learning opportunities. And you can see, of course, you can measure results in something like the PISA test. No? On the vertical axis, you can measure the success in educating their populations really well. Here, I'm sort of adding up mathematics, reading, and science, everything we try to look at. And on the horizontal axis, you can think about how well do education systems succeed in educating students from all social backgrounds. No? Quality upwards, equity rightwards. And you can see that there are huge differences in both dimensions in the relative success of education systems. The Czech Republic facing big challenges, coming out so-so, an average performer on the vertical axis. Mind you, this is 2009. I know that a lot of things have happened in the Czech Republic, and those things will translate, you know, improvements over time. You know, implemented reforms always translate into results. But the Czech Republic also has a challenge to give students from disadvantaged backgrounds better opportunities to reap their talent. There's a lot of potential for growth in most education systems. But I think the most encouraging insight from this chart is actually that you can actually educate children from all socioeconomic backgrounds well. The countries in the green quadrant over there tell us that it's actually possible to make high quality education a reality for children from all social backgrounds. You look at the top performing education systems, Shanghai in China, highly diverse population, many students from highly disadvantaged backgrounds, living in severe poverty, and yet those children reach almost the same standards as everybody else in that country. Certainly better standards than children in most European countries. There is a lot of progress possible. I think that's the most important message that international comparisons give us. There's a lot of scope and a lot of perspective for actually dramatic improvement. How does improvement look in the 21st century? Well, let's move from what we expect to what the kind of learning environments are going to look like or need to look like. The first thing has to do, if we want to make lifelong learning a reality for all, is that students are actually owners of their own learning processes. You know, in school you control the learning processes of people. Once they're out of school, you need to rely on their own initiative. And the capacity and motivation of individuals to expand their horizon is going to be key for the success of 21st century societies. And when you look actually at emerging results from our new PIAC survey, where we looked at adult skills, you actually can see there are huge differences across nations. Some countries have virtually made education a lifelong activity. People grow in their competences over the life cycle. But in the majority of countries, it is not looking like this. In the majority of countries, we can actually see after the age of 30, the degree of our competence is diminishing. We're doing really well up front, but we're not maintaining that momentum for getting people owners of their own learning processes. This has to do with fostering lifelong skills-oriented learning instead of just accumulating degrees up front in people's life course. You know, I'm a good example. I have a physics degree. If you look at my CV, my qualification is physics. And I believe I was a good physicist when I worked in industry in my first part of my career. You put me in a laboratory today, but probably I'm not going to do a particularly good job because the field has totally evolved. I've lost the skills I didn't use, the field has evolved and so on. But I did learn other things that are nowhere reflected in my formal credentials. And that's something that the modern world is about, recognizing skills, not formal qualifications. It has to do with being acutely sensitive to individual differences. Diversity in education and in classrooms is dramatically rising. Personalization, approach of teachers to recognize, understand individual differences, respond to them. To establish a culture of continual assessment and feedback. Understanding, where do I stand? How do I become better? Not once in a year, every day. We can sort of look at this in the form of two cultures. There's a culture that focuses all on outcomes, and there's a culture that focuses all on processes. Both have their merits, but none is sufficient. If you don't do either, well, you know, there's no question about it. You end up in deprivating your people now. Nobody knows where they stand. However, if you just focus on sort of outcome-based management, introducing more tests, more assessment, and so on, without thinking about processes, you end up losing ownership in the profession. You end up with external control, uninformed prescription to people. If you go to the other extreme, you go to just looking at the processes, believing people inspection, evaluating at the qualitative level without looking at the outcomes. You rely on the goodwill of people. There are some countries that are very good at that. Finland is an example. But it's very, very hard to actually replicate this. The key to a good assessment culture really is to combine the focus on outcomes with a focus on processes. This is where you create this kind of integrated quality management atmosphere that generates quality and trust. But it's easy to say, really, really hard to actually do in practice. Balancing autonomy and accountability. The Czech Republic has made enormous progress in strengthening autonomy in the system. You look at the responsibilities that schools had in the year 2000, you look at the responsibilities they have today, a world of difference. But this is a warning signal from our PISA survey. What I'm doing here is actually I contrast the level of autonomy that schools have with the kind of knowledge sharing mechanisms that the system provides. I call that here accountability, but that doesn't mean sort of test-based accountability. That basically means the mechanism an education system has to share and spread knowledge. And you can see the highest performing schools internationally are the ones that have a strong sense of ownership, a lot of autonomy, but that operate within a very, very strong system. The lowest performing schools are the ones that have a high degree of autonomy, but that operate in isolation. So autonomy can actually work for you, and autonomy can work against you in a system. The question is not, is autonomy good or is it bad? The question is, in what framework is school autonomy embedded? And that's very, very important to get right. Being demanding for every student, and I put the emphasis on every student, is a big predictor for success on PISA. The highest performing education systems make it very clear to every student, every parent, every teacher, what good performance is. You cannot buy yourself in a high-performing university in those countries. You will not get a great job without demonstrating in school that you can make a difference. And that drives, for example, the value of education in countries like Asia. People say, well, this is the Confucian culture and so on. No, it's the way in which society values the outcomes of education. Very, very important. And what we see in the Czech Republic, but in many countries, this is particularly for children with disadvantaged backgrounds, we're very quick to level down the horizon. We're very quick to tell them, well, you know, you don't speak so well the language, you're not so good in math, you better take an easier course. And very quickly, we have what we see in the results, that social background is a big driver of success. Fostering demand-sensitive learning, involving employers. I want to show you one piece of data from our adult skills survey that actually has on the vertical axis the skills of people, measured, and on the horizontal axis the age of people, from 16 to 25. If you are in education in school or university, the line is going upwards. No? Our data show if you are in school, you actually learn something. No? If you are combining education and work in very different ways, you start out lower because that's usually not people's first choice. No? If people have the choice, you know, I go to school and I have to do all the work, they go for the former. But actually, they end up at the very same point. Isn't that interesting? You know, these are not the most talented people, but they end up at the very same point as the others when it comes to generic foundation skills. No? The integration of education and work can be highly conducive to learning, and we're not very good at that. Of course, we have vocational education, but that's not what I mean. Think about academic education in schools. How good are we in bringing the experience of the world of work into the learning process in schools? No? How good are we to bring the process of pedagogy into the field of work when it comes to vocational education? There's a lot we can learn. Even people who are only in work, you can see they learn something. They never end up in the point because that's also a big selection effect. But we also see, and this comes back to the concept of inflation, that people who are not in education and not in work end up worse than how they started. Skills you do not use, you actually lose. Now that's why young people who do not have a good chance for employment are actually in really, really trouble. They end up worse than how they started. The share is not dramatic in the Czech Republic. It's still doing quite well on it, but it's been rising quite significantly during the period of the economic crisis. So something to worry about. But keeping learning beyond school, integrating work and study, ensuring that learning is social and collaborative. No? Everybody says this, you know, nobody disputes that. But what we do about it? No? We say learning should be a social enterprise, but at the end of the school year, we give people an individual certificate, no? Describing their individual performance. No? There's very little of a premium for actual demonstrated collaborative experience. But as you could see, it's the most steeply rising skill category in demand. No? The labor market values us for us. Innovation is no longer you having a great idea and then doing it. Innovation has to do with your capacity to share and mobilize the knowledge of lots of people and then finding the dots where the next innovation comes from. Big challenge for schools. And then promoting connections across subjects. Once again, the world is not divided into subject matter disciplines. There are artificial constructs of the academic disciplines. The world is integrated and we need to help students to make those connections better than we do today. These are just some attributes. It's a very, very tough summit to get there. One thing that we know for sure is that you don't get there without high quality teachers. Now, the quality of an education system can never exceed the quality of its teachers. Very simple, but hard to do. It has to do with investing resources where they can make most of a difference, attracting the most talented people into the teaching profession. And there are some countries that have become very, very good at that. Finland gets the most talented people into the teaching profession, not because they pay them very well. They're not as badly paid as teachers in the Czech Republic, but not very well paid either. But the work organization is highly, highly attractive. But it has to also with making spending choices. And I just want to show you one piece of data here that shows you basically the red dot is sort of the money that countries invest per student relative to their spending capacity. You know? The dot is high, basically a lot of your GDP per capita goes into education of students. As the dot is low, relatively little. But much more interesting is that countries spend their money very, very differently. The green bar is about salaries. Some countries, the Asian countries in particular, prioritize high teacher salaries. No? They pay people relatively well to attract great people into the teaching profession. Other countries say, and that's the blue bar, well, you know, we want to make classes very small. And if you look at the Czech Republic, what makes the system relatively inexpensive are actually below average salaries, and it's also the instruction time. Students don't have the kind of long school days that we have in many other countries. What makes the education systems relatively expensive is that there are lots of teachers for fewer students. When you compare that actually with many of the highest performing education systems across the OECD, you can see that they do exactly the opposite. They may also spend more on education, that's a different story, but they tend to prioritize the quality of teachers over the size of classes. The amount of money that you spend on education only accounts for 20% of the performance differences that we see across OECD countries on PISA. A lot more important is how you invest, and the kind of spending choices really make a very important difference. Let's have a look. Finland, you know, makes the teaching profession the second most highest status in the country. Second profession with the second highest status in the country. They get 10 applications for every open teaching post. Again, not because salaries are good, but because the work environment offers so many opportunities. There are real career perspectives for teachers. They can grow in their careers. There are teacher perspectives for collaboration with other teachers and so on. I spoke with Pasi Salberg in Finland, an expert there, about what makes teaching so attractive, and listen to what he said about that.
Teaching profession in Finland has always been popular, and this is what I hear in many other countries, that teaching used to be a very popular profession among young people. I think the good question is that how Finland has been able to maintain teaching in a school as something that attracts young people. And I think that what distinguishes our schools from the many other schools that we have been able to keep teaching profession firstly intellectually attractive and interesting for teachers. In other words, that our teachers, they feel that they can use the knowledge and skills that they learn in teacher education fully. They have a role in curriculum planning and design. They have a very important role in assessing students' performance.
So what you see actually, I mean, the key word is really keeping teaching intellectually attractive. No? Having the teaching profession own its professional practices. No? Very, very important ingredient. You go to the other part of the world, to Singapore, and very different culture, very different context, but you hear people talking about the very same things. I had the privilege of working in the National Institute of Education in Singapore for some time, and I interviewed Professor Tan, who works there in the curriculum department, and listen how he defines a good teacher.
Let me describe the philosophy behind our curriculum. First of all, we prepare a teacher to be first a teacher of the learner, number one, and number two, to be a good teacher of the subject. So the essential foundation is that a good teacher must first of all be very passionate and clear about how to help people learn and how people learn best.
You can actually see very, very similar ideas and concepts. Well, of course, we expect our teachers to be really, really good at the subjects they teach. I think that's the obvious foundation, but it's got to go beyond it. It's got to involve about pedagogy, about teaching strategies, about the capacity to mobilize different strategies for different students. And actually, when we looked at this with some data, unfortunately here I don't have data about the Czech Republic, but when we asked teachers about what good teaching was, most teachers around the world could actually give us a very good impression about, you know, effective teaching strategies. But when we asked teachers what they actually do, we got this picture, which tells us a very, very traditional approach to teaching, front-loaded. Very little emphasis on student-oriented teaching practices, even less emphasis on the kind of project-based enhanced teaching activities that we all aspire to. So there's something in education system that prevents people from doing the kind of things they themselves know work best. Sweden is a country that has been quite good in actually strengthening that kind of culture. But again, Finland has been really, really good at this. And you can see this already in the way they educate their teachers. You know, in Finland, every incoming teacher has to do a research master's thesis. And then people ask themselves, so why do they want their teachers to do a research master's thesis? And the answer is, we want our teachers to remain researchers throughout their lives. No? We're not going to tell them what to do in the government. We want those teachers actually to create the 21st century teaching practices. But that's not the only part. The other part of this is that very early on in the career of teachers, universities play a role, but the big part of the role is actually paid by schools. Schools are actually the main educators of teachers in Finland. Listen to how this works. I spoke with an English teacher in Finland to explain that to me.
So the teacher trainees need to have a certain amount of years of their subject learned at the university before they can enter the teacher training program. Teacher training for subject teachers lasts for a year. And so initially they start with theory. They are at the university for some weeks. Then they come to us for a period of orientation where they meet their mentor teachers and they get to see the classrooms. And then there's a period during which they teach in pairs. After that, they go back to the university to get some more theory. They also have now some experience. They're able to maybe ask different questions because they have some experience from the practical side of things. And so it's kind of a wave back and forth between coming to get the practical side at the school and then going back to gain some more information regarding theory.
It's actually also very interesting. You know, I mentioned that 8 out of 10, there are 8 applicants for 10 teaching posts. And who gets the post finally? Well, first you have to bring the academic qualifications, but the test of truth is not that. The hardest point of selection is actually when you're evaluated by peers and principals at the front line for your pedagogical talent. That's the tough part where people really need to get through. The next part I want to sort of highlight is the need to really understand how learning actually happens, to develop modern learning strategies. And when you think about Japan, you know, most of you would still probably think, well, Japan, do we really want to be like Japan? Rote learning, memorization, and so on. But actually what's so interesting that is Japan has changed more than any other country in the OECD in changing that paradigm. And it's still highly relevant for the Czech Republic as well. You know, the Czech students on the PISA test are far better on the tasks requiring the reproduction of subject matter content than tasks requiring the creative use and application of skills. Here, this is an interesting chart looking at changes. On the left side, I have the responses of students to multiple choice tasks, reproducing knowledge. On the right side, I have the responses where students had to create knowledge. And what we can see in the OECD area, it's gone up a bit here and it's gone up more there. So you could say, well, in the industrialized world, we are moving in the right direction. We are moving towards 21st century skills, no? But really very slowly. And when you look at Japan, you can see it was like this and that. Why do I highlight this chart? Because what this actually shows is not only about class sizes and teacher salaries and so on. You can actually change instructional practice, no? This is something that you cannot sort of implement it top down. This is only happening because teachers started to teach in different ways in the case of Japan. Enhancing creative, and there were some very, very controversial reforms in that involved. No? They took out, for example, 30% of curriculum content, no? And parents didn't like it, teachers didn't like it, everybody protested. But they were able actually to strengthen cognitive depth instead of number and volume of learning material. And they were very, very effective in enhancing the knowledge and skills of people. I think this kind of data should encourage us that we can actually change the instructional paradigms that are prevalent in classrooms today. And a lesson from Japan, and that's why I actually choose Japan here, I believe is highly relevant for the Czech Republic in this context. Helping teachers to reflect on their own practices. Something Sweden is doing really well. If you look at school principals in Sweden, they're not only managing their own school, they ask themselves every day, you know, how do we know that what we do is the right thing to do? How do we know how other people deal with the same kind of challenges? What do we know about other schools? If you are a school principal in Finland, very, very similar. In some regions, you're actually not only a principal of your own school, but you spend about 1/3 of your time as a person working in the municipality. So you are suddenly in charge partly of the system, partly of your school. You work with other principals, a lot of opportunities for knowledge sharing. That's very much what 21st century school development really needs to look at. Teacher collaboration, mobilizing the good ideas that are already in the system. We live in a time, where the best minister of education can no longer solve the problems of hundreds of thousands of students and hundreds of thousands of teachers. But if you can mobilize the talent that is in the teaching population, you can actually achieve a lot of things. Canada is a very, very good example. The province of Ontario has been very, very effective in leveraging the talent in its teaching population through a new leadership strategy. Very, very interesting work. Singapore, other end of the world. Very impressive how you see teachers in a very systematic way collaborating to prepare lessons, to evaluate lessons, to learn with each other, from each other. Every teacher in Singapore has 100 hours every year to continue their professional learning. Huge investment in the professionalization of teachers. I met a young principal in Singapore who actually explained to me how this approach works, and listen to him.
To do that, really we get teachers to work together, to collaborate, and to look at each other's practice in the classroom. I think that is essential and really very critical, because the good teaching practices should not reside within the four walls and be kept to one teacher, and I think there is a lot of sharing that we can have in this school.
What you want to do right now is, okay, think of the Socratic questions, okay, what do I want to use to further define, clarify? Now, okay, I will go on the internet, I will find any sort of evidence that will help support this statement or refute this.
Professional learning community in schools was started basically to ensure that teachers had a platform to develop their teaching practices. Our main focus actually is to make sure that students learn best. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate. We exchange ideas, we try out, we test, and eventually we check for results. And the intention really is to share ideas to make it better for the students.
And this is actually something they didn't invent. We take that for granted in many other professions. Who does most of the medical research? No? Not people in universities. Medical research is done by medical practitioners. No? People work there and actually improve, advance their own practice. And that's not yet a very common theorem in the field of education. But if you look at some of the most advanced education systems, they've become quite good at actually doing this. Technology, I put that last, because actually this is where our evidence base at the OECD is still quite thin. There's a great hope that people place in technologies. We don't yet have the evidence that actually works there. Well, probably you can say good technology can leverage good teaching, but we have no evidence that you can actually use great technology to replace poor teaching. Most of those efforts, have really not gone very, very far. There are some very inspiring efforts, I think, in Australia, in New Zealand. There are actually a very, very good network to support schools with 21st century kind of learning environments, learning instruments. I think a lot of things we can learn from that, but it's not that widely spread. An exception again to this, these are Singapore schools, where we do see technology playing a very, very big role, particularly because they have these very large classrooms. Once again, the classroom that you saw before, very modern building, great technology, great teachers, everything there, and it costs about, it costs actually half what the OECD classroom costs, and actually still less than what classrooms in the Czech Republic cost. How do they actually do this? They have these very large classes. And how do they enable teachers to actually work in large classes? They use a lot of technology. Listen to this.
So we look at technology very meaningfully, and we see how can we leverage this technology to make a very significant impact in the classroom instruction. I'll give you an example. In a classroom of 40, it is really impossible to get 40 students to ask 40 questions at one go. When we use the instant messaging tool, we open 40 windows to 40 kids. They could ask 40 questions at the same time, and the teacher could see their thinking on the technology tool that they use. And kids get more excited because they are using the tools that they are very, very good in using, not just the pen and the pencil.
Right, everything consolidated on one PowerPoint slide. Use the main thing as a skeleton, then you add on to the different parts. Okay?
A lot of our younger teachers are coming in. They're a lot more savvy in the use of information communication technology tools. And I see them teaching the more senior teachers how to use those tools effectively.
You can see the same thing. Korea is another example of a country that has put a lot of hope into this. With mixed success, I must say. These are not magic bullets. But actually, when you see Korean students in the subway going home from school, they see them on their mobile phones and they're not playing. They're actually doing their homework on their mobile phone. And what's really interesting is, you go to the Ministry of Education and they can actually see what children they can aggregate that information and see what's actually the implemented curriculum. They know basically through this kind of technology platform where learning fails, what are the difficult areas, the easier areas, and so on. So there's very significant potential, but it's really, really hard to do. The last point I really want to make is about getting the best resources into the toughest groups. There's a lot of talent in every education system. How do you mobilize the talent? How do you get the most qualified teachers into the most difficult classrooms? How do you get the best principals into the toughest schools? It's a challenge which many education systems face. It's a challenge very, very relevant to the Czech Republic. According to our data, you can see the large between-school variability in the case of your country. How do you actually do that? Some countries have tried to do that with money, paying teachers more for getting into tougher schools. You actually, if you want to do this, you have to pay a lot more money to make a bit of a difference. It's very, very hard to do with money. What we have actually found in our comparisons that career incentives are the most promising route to get there. If you structure teacher careers around taking on challenges, that's the most promising route to success. One country that has had a huge impact with is actually China, in the region of Shanghai. If you're a vice principal in Shanghai in a high-performing school, one of those elite schools, and you go to your government and said, I really want to become a principal, they say, well, we can promote you. But first, please show us that you can actually turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So you spend 1-2 years in one of the toughest areas. You're not alone there. You can actually take some of your colleagues with you. You build a new learning environment. You show that you can actually improve it. And you become a principal now. Very, very good at incentivizing people to take on tough challenges. Listen to how they explain that themselves.
那么如何来改变这种现状呢？我们就想到了，是不是能够把一些好的学校与相对困难的学校结成办学联合体呢？这个建议得到了我们教育行政部门，当然也得到了社区的广泛的认同与支持。于是我们就开展了这项工作。那么这项工作是怎么来做的呢？从政府来说，我们出台了相应的政策，就是鼓励与支持办学相对好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子。第二呢，我们好的学校与相对困难的学校结成对子呢，我们要签订一个合作办学的协议。这个合作办学协议里面呢，就是明确了各自的责任、权利与义务。
So why is this relevant? A very different cultural context, but actually if you think about it, if you look at it closely, Shanghai in China has a lot more similarities with the school system in the Czech Republic than you might think, including the way the school system is governed. The education ministry in Shanghai has very little operational control over schools. Schools are highly autonomous. It has very little control over who goes where to work. It's a highly dynamic, more or less market-based education system. So what did the government do? It had no operational control, but it was very, very good in redesigning incentive and career structures about people taking on tougher challenges. And actually, at the end of the day, the most impressive results, in 2003 we had still very patchy PISA results for Shanghai, and they were on average across the OECD countries. In 2009, they were right at the top of the industrialized world. A lot of improvement that actually was leveraged in a short period of time. And that's sort of the common thread that really goes through many education systems. We have seen your neighbor Poland being very, very impressive in raising performance, reducing disparities, reducing underperformance, strengthening excellence in the system. There are many systems around the world that have been really, really good in addressing this kind of 21st century challenges. I want to skip this last section because we don't have much time. I want to jump right to the conclusions and basically talk about the kind of levers that we have in the 21st century. Innovation is going to be a very, very central part to this. It has to do with innovation inspired by science and research, knowing more about education. If you think about it, in the case of the Czech Republic, you spend about 15 times as much on medical research than you spend on educational research, despite the fact that both sectors consume similar amounts of public spending. And that tells you something about the value knowledge has in a profession. But it's also about innovation and knowledge inspired by practitioners. How do you get, it's very easy to get knowledge into the classroom. You can mandate this. But how do you get good practice out of the classroom? Knowledge by practitioners. Getting users, students, parents, communities. How do communities get the information they need to actually take an influence on the education system? Very important. And then, of course, entrepreneurial development. A lot of things that we can think about. If you think about this sort of in summary, in the past, you know, education was easy. We only needed a few well-educated workers and a lot of people who do the work. And that's basically the origin of most of our education systems, particularly in Europe, very much modeled around an industrial work organization. Today, the premium on better skills is rising and the penalty on lower skills is dramatically rising. So we need all students to succeed. Some people say that's a total illusion. Well, look at the PISA data. It's happening. 21st century learning in that sense is a reality today in some European countries, in many Asian countries, in Canada is a North American country. All students can succeed, even in subjects like mathematics, where we believe they are subject to talent. We actually did something very interesting. We asked students, you know, what do you believe makes you successful in a field like mathematics? And you have many students in the Czech Republic who tell you, it's clear, no? It's all about talent. You know, if I'm not born as a genius in mathematics, I better study something else. No? If you ask that very same question to a Japanese or a Chinese students, 9 out of 10 tell you, it depends on me. If I invest the effort, if I try hard, my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful. What does it tell you about an education system? On the one hand, you know, education is about sorting people. Those who are actually right to be sorted, they're going to succeed, the rest not. In the other case, everyone is going to succeed. There's no excuse for failure on nobody's part. No? And that's what the future is about, helping all students to learn at very, very high levels. The second part, I've talked enough about it, I don't need to stress it more, is to move from routine cognitive skills that we believe are making people fit for a lifetime towards learning to learn, to enable complex ways of thinking, to enable complex ways of working, 21st century competences. The challenge is that that requires a very, very different caliber of teachers. When you can basically describe what teachers should be doing in a book, the model of the industrial worker, you don't need great teachers. No? Many people can do that. And that's why the aspiration of teachers, the professional status of teachers is often quite low, because people believe, oh, well, you know, teaching a textbook, anybody can do that. That's not very demanding. But in this knowledge society, you actually need to have high-level professional knowledge workers who create the educational content. Governments today set the scene, they set the goals. Societies define what they want students to learn, but they actually enable their teachers to translate that into pedagogical practice. And that requires a very different caliber of people. But you know, high-level professional knowledge workers don't like to work in Tayloristic work environment where everybody tells them, you know, this is what you do today, tomorrow, and the day after. That's the simple truth. And that's why even, you know, you take Luxembourg. You think maybe, oh, we just pay teachers more and everything is going to be solved. Well, Luxembourg pays the teachers twice as much as what you do, and it's still not a more prestigious occupation. You know, because it's a lot more to do with that kind of work organization that the 21st century is going to look like. Differentiated and diverse careers are going to be the key. That's a big challenge for government. It's a big challenge for unions. No? Unions, like governments, like and prefer standardization. But the future really lies in differentiated and much more diverse careers. And it relies on a different philosophy of accountability. In the past, we are feeding information up in the system, you know, getting sort of people that are above me, giving them the information. Today, accountability has to do with accountability to peers and the public, no? Making sure my neighbor knows what I'm doing. It's about professional autonomy in a collaborative culture. Very big challenges in the 21st century, but there is also lots of encouraging insights. We did see a lot of progress. When you look at the PISA results from the year 2000 and you look at the PISA results from the year 2009, you see that actually there has been huge improvements in raising the quality in some countries. Other countries have been very successful in moderating inequalities. And yet other countries have been able to demonstrate that you can actually produce better value without actually spending more on education. I think there's a lot I think we all can learn from those successes. Thank you very much.
Wow. Dámy a pánové, pan Andreas Schleicher. A pan Schleicher není ještě zcela vyčerpán svým řečnickým výkonem. Pochopili jste, že by mohl přednášet mnoho hodin a stále by měl o čem, ale respektuje časový plán, za což mu děkujeme. A součástí časového plánu je možnost se ho teď na něco zeptat. Ten prostor pro dotazy je asi 15, 17 až 20 minutový. To není úplně málo. To znamená, kdo chcete, a ano, správně, pan Schleicher bude potřebovat sluchátka. I'm really sorry. It will be much more better than my translation. U dvojice z těch 5 zadních dveří mám kolegyně, slečny asistentky s mikrofonem. Stačí lehce zvednout ruku a položit dotaz, pokud si někdo troufáte. V předních řadách jsem ochoten dotazy pro Andrease Schleichera pozbírat samostatně. Kdo si užije tu možnost zeptat se našeho váženého hlavního řečníka jako první? Jdu za vámi. Dobré odpoledne, máte slovo.
Dobré odpoledne. Ček? Jo? Tak česky. Já bych se chtěla zeptat, jak vidíte význam předškolního vzdělávání, protože to je takový trochu problém taky v České republice a vím, že je celá řada statistik, která řadí Českou republiku na jedno z posledních míst v možnostech předškolního vzdělávání. Já se domnívám, já jsem senátorka parlamentu České republiky, tak se domnívám, že to je jeden z úkolů příští vlády a vůbec OECD má jistě plno údajů o této problematice.
Děkujeme paní senátorce za otázku.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That is a big challenge, but at the very same time, our data actually show that the Czech Republic is one of the most rapidly improving countries on that dimension. A lot of more young people in early childhood education today. That's at least about the quantity of supply. I think there are bigger questions about the qualifications of staff, the kind of people working there, the environment there, and so on. I think those are the bigger questions. But in terms of giving more young people an opportunity, the Czech Republic is a good example for actually how you can improve and change that situation. Is it a sort of unique recipe for success? Well, it can be a very, very important foundation, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But there are also countries, France, where my children go to school, is doing really well in early childhood education, but you do not see that success when children are at the age of 12, 15 years. So you need to maintain that success. You can build that foundation, but school really needs to sort of take that further and advance that.
Děkujeme. Další dotazy, dámy a pánové, zprava, zleva. Letím. Chtěl jsem říct, bude dobré, když se tazatel představí.
Dobrý den, Klaus, Gymnázium Fork. Já bych se chtěl zeptat, jak vy osobně silně věříte datům z FISy, z toho testování žáků. Kdybyste měl na škále soft data 0, hard data 100, jako říci tu vaši sílu těchto dat. Děkuji.
Děkuji za dotaz.
I'm not sure I understood the translation well.
Okay, it's a question of your trust to the results of PISA.
Yeah. Any kind of performance evaluation is a proxy. The skills of the people is something we can only indirectly observe to the performance of students on the test. What I can say is that we have actually tried and developed very hard to provide robust instruments, and they provide highly predictive results. The most powerful sort of variable that convinces me that those data are trustworthy is that actually when we do longitudinal studies, when we follow the 15-year-olds up into life, that those scores actually are highly predictive of the jobs that people get, of the kind of opportunities they get in higher education. So, the PISA results are highly predictive for the future success, and that is for us a very important indicator of their reliability. There's no perfect measure. PISA does not measure many important dimensions of competency. If you think about interpersonal skills and so on, they're not yet captured by the quantitative measures that we currently have. But, what we can say today, what we do measure, makes a huge difference for the success of people.
Vydržte, zde je tazatel před vámi.
Dobrý den, já jsem Jaromír Kříž, majitel firmy Merkur, která vyvinula nový stavebnicový učební systém Merkur Education a já postrádám u našich žáků a studentů a chtěl bych navázat na paní senátorku, především u dětí na základních školách, aby se vytvořila taková u nich mechanická tvořivá činnost. To se samozřejmě projeví potom na dalším vzdělání ve středních školách a vysokých školách. Já to mám zmapovaný, jak na středních školách, tak na základních školách i univerzitách a potvrzuji vaše slova, že ty země, které chtějí být ekonomicky vyspělé, ekonomický růst, musí vzdělání věnovat velkou pozornost. Mám zkušenosti z Finska, dokonce si teďka dopisuju s premiérem Senegalu, který chce sem přijet podívat, protože všichni si uvědomí, jak je to důležité. Tak bych se vás chtěl zeptat, jak vy hodnotíte právě tu praktickou dovednost a zručnost, tvořivou činnost.
Děkuji.
Yeah. This is absolutely important, and it's not only to do with sort of on the mechanical aspect. It is about making learning and science relevant, bringing sort of the real world into the classrooms. And one of the things that we observe in many countries, not just your country, is that students in primary schooling are fascinated by science. They really love science. They think science is opening their eyes. They understand the world around them. Students in secondary school think science is a terribly boring school subject that has only to do with numbers, nothing to do with their current and future lives. Why is that? Because we are not doing what you're saying. We are not making science sort of something that has to do with the application with the real life. And I think there are many dimensions in which we can actually improve this. And many of the not all of the high-performing systems. Some of the high-performing systems in East Asia teach science like they do in the Czech Republic. But some others have become very good in bringing sort of scientists with the scientific approach into classrooms and giving students hands-on practical experience in science. So I do believe, not just on the cognitive sides, but more importantly to motivate more young people actually to aspire to scientific careers, we need to actually give them those kinds of perspectives.
Děkuji za odpověď. Za sebe dodávám, že kdyby mi rodiče dopřáli Merku radost v dětství, mohl jsem to dotáhnout jinam než do médií. Tak, je tady další otázka z první řady.
Děkuji. Dobrý den, Daniel Minich, CERGEI. Já bych otázkou navázal na dotaz mého Václava Klause, souseda, který se ptal, jak věříme kvalitě dat PISA. Já musím říct, že jsem s nima strávil asi rok a snažil jsem se zjistit v těch datech jednotlivců, jak jsou sbíraná, co stojí za poklesem české vzdělanosti 15letých posledních 9 letech od roku 2001, 2003 až do roku 2009. A musím říct, že ta data vypadají velice věrohodně. Dá se v nich odhalit spousta věcí, ale spousta věcí se v nich odhalit také nedá, protože spousta věcí se děje i mimo školu a spousta věcí se děje mimo rámec toho, co jsou data schopná zachytit. A zároveň jsem zjistil, že když člověka zajímaví podrobné věci, konkrétně určitého vzdělávacího systému, Česká republika, tak mezinárodní data, jako jsou PISA, jsou příliš široká. Ty se snaží popsat všechny systémy, ale ty detailní otázky je potřeba zkoumat vlastně v té zemi dané. A jsou potřeba další data a jsou hlavně potřeba výzkumníci. A má zkušenost je, že v České republice, a už to tady ve vaší řeči bylo řečeno, že v medicíně ten výzkum je 100násobně intenzivnější než ve školství. Já bych se chtěl zeptat, jestli OECD něco dělá na podporu toho, aby ta intenzita zkoumání dat těch národních, v těch jednotlivých zemích narostla aspoň na tu úroveň, jako je v medicíně, protože dneska skutečně v zemích jako Česká republika a další postkomunistické ta úroveň výzkumu je velice nízká, slabá a vlastně my máme spoustu otázek, ale neznáme na ně odpovědi. Děkuji.
Yeah. I think, I would immediately agree that, assessment has to be a multi-layered system. It is about assessing in the classroom, it's about assessing the school, it's about assessing the national system, it's about the international dimension. And every layer becomes more general, becomes harder to do comparisons, but it also offers additional insights. I agree, every education system is highly specific in the way it operates. But at the very same time, we live in a global economy. And the criterion for success is no longer just improvement by national standards. Do I become better by what I think is success, but also the most successful education system. So international assessments like PISA should not replace national standards, national assessment, but they are a very, very important complement. They tell us what is possible in education. You do not find that out when you only look at yourself. Do not look at others. They tell us the pace of change that is impossible. You know, how fast can you actually progress? You know, if Poland improved so fast, well, you know, why isn't that not happening in other countries? I think those kinds of questions we can only ask by opening our eyes to the outside world. But you're right, they should not replace and look inside into the classroom. That's why, you know, good assessment has all these different layers. It's a responsibility of teachers in the classroom. It's a responsibility of schools. It's a responsibility of systems. But the international perspective adds, in my view, very, very important innovative insights. It's true, you know, it's very hard to find a set of tasks that are equally important for countries. But, you know, to test your hypothesis, we did actually a very interesting experiment. Because I heard that kind of objection many times. You know, countries tell me, well, you know, if you had tested children around the world on my criteria, we would have done better or worse. So one of the things that we did is one day we asked every country to tell us how relevant are each of the PISA tasks in terms of your own curricular objectives. No? Tell us which are the tasks that are really good for your country and the tasks that are less appropriate. And then we ranked every country on everybody's favorites. So we ranked, for example, every country in the world on what the Czech Republic told us were the most appropriate tasks in the Czech Republic. And what did we find? Every country performed a little bit better when measured on its own criteria, but this was true for other countries as well. So relatively speaking, we saw almost no difference. There were only actually 2 countries for which this made a big impact. One was Norway, which would have performed a lot better if they had been measured on their national tasks, and one which would have performed worse, it was Korea. Very interesting as well. Educators there aspired to kind of things that were part of PISA that were not realized in Korean classrooms. But for most countries, you know, the difference that made in terms of national performance was actually surprisingly little in relative terms.
Děkuji. Možná slečna má k vám blíž. Držte ruku nahoře, ať vás nepřeběhne. Jedna z posledních otázek.
Oldřich Botlík. Já jsem už dlouho přesvědčen, že těm pozitivním změnám v našem školství brání v podstatě velice konzervativní převládající přesvědčení veřejnosti. A chci se zeptat, protože se domnívám, že v těch úspěšnějších zemích k těm změnám muselo dojít demokratickým způsobem, jaké jsou možnosti pozitivního ovlivňování veřejného mínění ve vztahu ke školství?
Děkujeme za otázku.
Well, I think you highlight one of the most fundamental changes. You know, we live in society. Everybody, you know, wants a lot of reform in the education systems, but not for their own children. Everybody sort of has only one chance. So we have a very conservative environment for education. It's very, very hard to make things different. If you change the curriculum today, the parents will think, well, my child wants to pass the university exam, so don't do it now, do it later. That's, I think, the general environment in which we live. How did countries succeed? Well, there are different answers to this. If you look at Finland, you know, in the 1960s, Finland had the same kind of education system that you find in the Czech Republic or in Germany, highly stratified, highly centralized, and so on. When did it change? Well, in the middle of a deep economic crisis, the country realized, you know, we will no longer succeed with a system that only serves a few students. We've got to change our model and approach. And they actually had a radical reform born out of a very, very deep economic recession. My country, Germany, in the year 2000, people in there, basically everybody thought, well, you know, education may not be great, but it's good enough. Don't worry about it. Suddenly they see the PISA results, below average, large inequalities. And that actually triggered an enormous public debate. You know, I would think sort of the political environment was always reactive in education. Politicians would have not spearheaded big changes because it doesn't, unfortunately, the payoff for policy is very sort of, it's only in the long term. You know, you do not win very much by changing education. But the pressure from the public was so strong that actually policymakers did engage in very, very, very significant changes. And actually, you look at the results in 2009, you could see big improvements in quality, big improvements on equity. So actually things began to change. It was sort of reform driven by the public. Brazil was another very interesting example where actually, you know, results are very low in the year 2000, and this had no public impact. People say, well, this is some international test, so what do we care? We are in Brazil. The government did one thing that was really smart. They rolled out the PISA test to every school. They said, okay, you don't believe our national results, try for yourself, look for yourself. And actually suddenly schools, many parents in Brazil thought, well, the education system may be terrible, but the school of my child is really good. Suddenly they saw what the reality was, and it sparked a lot of improvement, also the willingness of teachers to engage in reform. So the avenues, if you look, Poland is an interesting case where you can actually say they started, it's very interesting for PISA because they started the reform just 1 year before we had the first PISA assessment, so you can actually track the impact. But it was also reform motivated by the understanding we need to get all young people to succeed in this education system, move away from high degree of stratification, more inclusive approach to education. The motivation has been very different, but I think the one thing that we can see, Japan, you saw the results here, in the year, it's actually a great experience there. In the year 2000, Japan performed very well on PISA. So many people could have said, we have a fantastic education system. But the actually policymakers there and educators looked very closely at the results, and they saw we are doing really, really well on the rote learning, but we are not doing well on the creative skills, the open-ended tasks and so on. So they actually started to move on that front. They were very much inspired by this. They had a quite significant curriculum reform, more focused sort of on the background, on instructional practice. The origins and motivations have been very, very different, but wherever countries have tried hard to do reforms. And I'm quite confident. I mean, there has been a lot of positive developments in the Czech Republic over the last years, and you're going to see the fruits of this work actually playing out in one or the other way in this kind of data.
Děkuji. A je tu příležitost položit poslední otázku v této fázi. Pokud se někdo k něčemu takovému chystá, půjčím rád mikrofon i do druhé řady.
Dvořák, Matematicko-fyzikální fakulta. Mluví se o vzdělávání pro 21. století. To je dlouhá doba. Jaká je vaše vize vzdělávání a vzdělávacích systémů, dejme tomu, v polovině tohoto století? Děkuji.
Yeah, of course, you raise a very legitimate insight. If we had met here 100 years ago, we would have asked ourselves, how many people actually do we need to finish school? No? Half of them, 60%, maybe 70%. Today, we raise that same question. The answer that we have in the OECD, as long as we see a rising premium on better skills, as we do today, there's every justification for government to make or countries, societies, to make a better effort to raise the skills of people. And so far, even up to the middle of the 21st century, our best bet is that this trend is going to rise. So we are seeing a dramatically rising demand for better skilled people. Better skills, getting more people skilled up, different types of skills. Many of the kind of policy levers that we have to deal with inequalities are no longer going to work. For example, if you look at the question of inequalities, we see that there are growing income inequalities. How do we deal with them today with taxes? We raise taxes from some, we give the money to others, but we're not going to solve the problem that you could see here, that those inequalities are largely driven by what people are able to do. So up to the middle of the 21st century, we're pretty confident that this is a long-term trend that we are seeing without no obvious end in sight. Technology is going to gain ever more in importance, which means, again, you need more advanced skills of people over the time. The fact is that the 21st century no longer pays you for what you know. It pays you for what you can do with what you know. And that is the kind of skills that actually are going to be very, very different.
Krásná myšlenka na závěr. Myslím, že lepší nemohla padnout. Pan Andreas Schleicher, děkujeme moc.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.